yeah, let's get started. So my topic for today is make your React Native apps accessible. I'm Ankita Kulkarni. As you all know already, I'm a solutions architect at Wrangle.io. So yeah, let's get started. So I want to start by asking a couple questions. How many of you have incorporated accessibility in your apps? Please raise your hand. Cool. And how many of you have incorporated accessibility for mobile apps? Oh, almost the same number. Very interesting. Cool. So I guess like hopefully after this talk, we can learn more on how we can add accessibility to mobile apps and also learn like some of the techniques we could use from the web. So what is accessibility? Accessibility means making your apps accessible to everyone. Any person can have one or more forms of disability. It could be someone who wears glasses, or someone who has become a new parent, or someone who has partial hearing loss. Now, disabilities could be permanent or temporary. And in terms of accessibility, we need to be inclusive and think about everyone. Just gonna go with the keyboard. So what is accessibility for mobile? Essentially, it means making your apps accessible for all mobile screen sizes, all devices. We've all heard of accessibility for the web, but for mobile, try turning on your voiceover, or when you are in an airplane, you notice that all these different apps, they don't perform very well when the internet connection is turned off, right? Or all of these different things. It means that we need to make our apps accessible for everyone, so we are kind of like, because we're kind of fitting in like more content on a smaller device. And that makes it really hard to understand. And we need to make this native world a more inclusive place for everyone. So as you can see, like disability is not the problem, right? So I'm not gonna say like, just because I wear glasses, I'm not gonna say that I have a problem, like I'm just gonna say I have a problem seeing. I'm just gonna say like I wear or need glasses. Similarly, we need to think about the language that we use as well and be more cautious about it. And yeah, that's everyone, just like friends. Accessibility also means that we need to design a seamless user experience for everyone. It means designing your apps in such a way that we don't think of like a specific persona, but we specifically think about everyone. And accessibility is a priority and not an afterthought. I'm really passionate about accessibility in general, so when I'm working with like different designers and developers, when we are actually working on stories, we start talking about accessibility from the get-go, just because we want to make sure that everyone understands what it takes, and if there are some compromises that we do need to make in terms of making the users understand, the clients understand, we kind of do that. But the reality is that everyone has had experience with disabilities in general, right? Whether you yourself are a person living with one or have a loved one living with one. So like my mom, for example, will always use the font scaling feature. She'll go into the settings and always increase the font size just because she wears glasses and she needs that, right? So yeah, this is like kind of the reality check that it can be you as well. It's not just someone who's maybe on a wheelchair or not. So these are all forms of different accessibilities. And all I'm going to say over here is that a lot of presentations talk about the business buy-in, on how like we need to care about the business and these number of users, we need to care about these number of users and so on. But what I'm going to say here, and I'm going to challenge that a little bit, and I'm going to say that we don't necessarily need to bring the business in the picture, right? So for example, let's say if you start thinking of accessibility as part of every story that you work on, then you don't need to like think about it as an afterthought. It kind of gets really expensive when you build this app and you don't think of accessibility at all, and towards the end, you add it as a feature, right? And that becomes really, really complicated because accessibility just like any other feature, right? It's like it's not something additional, it's just that there's a lack of awareness for it. So who here knows the principle of universal design? Cool. So I'm going to give more context on that. So it means that we need to provide the same means of use for all users. And one of the main principles of universal design is that we should avoid segregating or stigmatizing any specific user. And one example of this is the curb cut effect. Has anyone heard about the curb cut effect at all? Or seen a curb cut? I'm sure we all have. So essentially, let's say the idea behind the curb cut effect is that it's not designed for everyone, right? So let's say I am pushing a shopping cart and I'm carrying something heavy, or let's say someone is on a skateboard or someone is pushing a baby stroller on the curb. The curb cut effect, the idea behind this is like all these tasks are easier just because of the curb cut effect. And it's not designed specifically for someone because it accommodates everyone. And that's the idea behind universal design. This is a great example of that. And one thing I want to, like when I'm working with different clients, one thing I definitely want to make, we try to make them more aware that it's always an afterthought, just because we think about, oh, we don't want any more features, we don't want to think so much. But honestly, you are going to save so much more time and so much more development just if you don't make it an afterthought, and it shouldn't be in the first place. In fact, it ends up creating so much more work when you need to make an app accessible after the fact. So now that we have, I kind of went through what is accessibility and how it shouldn't be an afterthought and so on. But when it comes to accessibility, when I was working on the web and making the web apps accessible, I still kind of knew a lot of tools, and there were a lot of blog posts talking about it. But when I switched to mobile, specifically React Native, or not, but it's just like I wanted to learn how voiceover works in general, because that will make me aware how, in general, users are using the app. So let's take a quick look at a demo. So I'm going to try my best.
General, back button.
Cool.
Settings, back button.
Refresh. Okay, so this is essentially my settings menu in an iPhone, and I'm going and turning on voiceover. So what happened is I'm going to the switch and turning on voiceover, and every time you'll notice that once I hit one click, I press once, it's just going to read out the text. But if I press twice, it's going to invoke that action specifically. So let's take a look at that.
Settings, accessibility, portrait, voiceover, zoom, magnifier, display.
And we did a little bit of research as well. And in terms of users always go from top to bottom, essentially, whenever the screen reader will start reading any of the text, right? So over here, I'm just literally going through the list of all items, and it's going to read out the specific label and also the state that that specific label is in.
Accommodate, display, speech, but larger text, off, general, back button, settings, back button.
So notice one thing, how it says back button and so on. So these are specific properties that we do need to set. And just because this is a settings menu, Apple already has that. And then you can kind of imagine this being a flat list, right? Essentially displaying all the list of elements. And if you do add specific accessibility properties to this flat list, then you are going to get accessibility off the bat.
Accessibility, button, general, voiceover, on, accessibility, voiceover, voice.
So just a quick example on how voiceover works. And when I started learning more about it, honestly, this itself really helped me a lot, because I saw that there are so many apps out there on my phone that don't work and don't perform well when voiceover is on. It just doesn't tell me what's going on, and I really felt helpless, and I could not use my mobile phone at all. So let's see how we can add accessibility to our apps. And we sort of talk about from a design perspective, and then we'll look at some code as well. So yeah, be very mindful of colors. Pick colors that are already accessible with the right contracts and everything. If there are any designers out here, there's a tool in Sketch called Stark, which is a really good first step, just essentially trying to check if that specific color on that background, how it's going to match. And is it accessible or not? Because that's a really good first step that we need to be aware of. right? And if you essentially set up like a theme file of all colors, then you can kind of see like, you can always like modify those colors as well just to make them more accessible or not. And there's one tool other than Sketch that I really like. It's called Colorable. It's a great tool for picking accessible colors. So as you can see over here, I've added the hex, the RGB color code on like whatever the text label is going to be, and on the right-hand side is the background. And it will tell me if it's AA or AAA compliant. Obviously, you should strive for AAA, but AA is also a good start, right? Just like essentially in the presentation yesterday, even when we were looking at TypeScript, we weren't like, we didn't want to like essentially go for the most strict version of it, right? We always want to start with something and then add stuff to it. And that's the same thing with accessibility as well. Converting designers' palettes into common components. So one thing I should say about this is that let's follow the semantics. If we let's say if you're using a checkbox, let's just use whatever, I wouldn't say checkbox is a great example, but like, for example, whatever the semantic elements are that React Native APIs provide, if we essentially use those semantically, what makes sense, then you're going to get accessibility off the bat. You don't need to add patch in stuff, right, after that. And by converting these designers' palettes into common components, what I mean by that is like these are the different heading components, right? And if you add these accessibility properties and add wrappers around them, just with those additional accessibility properties itself, then you kind of get an idea. Everyone, all the developers on your team will know because the props are going to prompt them that, hey, like this is a required prop, accessibility label is a required prop, and so on. And we did this, we kind of do this with common components in like all our projects, just so that we can also have that discussion with the team saying what is optional, what is not, and so on. So this really helps us a lot. And you might have seen something like this in like all designers, like sketch files or whatever tools that they are using. And you could kind of use that and add accessibility properties to it. And as you all know, I love Storybook. So just using Storybook to help, it really helps you, Storybook helps you develop UI components in isolation, and it can really improve your component reuse, testability, and so on. And if you use Storybook to communicate, you can kind of track of which components are actually accessible and which components aren't. And then you can sort of see that, okay, we are maybe like 40% there, we still need to make these additional components accessible, and so on. Keeping animations minimal. So one thing to keep in mind is that be mindful of motion. If your app does have a lot of animations, maybe provide an option to turn it off or something, just because if users are sensitive to motion effects, then it actually is going to cause a lot of problems. So for example, like not just for any specific user, but like even when I personally like feel really dizzy, and if the animations are like really fast and I can't really control them, I don't use the app that day, and that becomes really inconvenient. So imagine like users with actually like more severe problems, like they're going to really face this, right? And that's why it's really important that we need to keep the animations minimal. And whenever you want to add animation, just make sure that there's an option to turn it off or slow it down possibly. One great thing about React Native is that you get font scaling for free. So as long as you use the text component that comes from React Native, from the API itself, and you go to your settings and turn on font scaling, it's going to increase and decrease the text automatically. So that's really great. So use the text APIs itself. This is like very important. A lot of times I see in apps that, just like we talked about, right? If you use all the Storybook components and make those individual components accessible, that's great. That's a really good start. But what about when they're grouped together, right? So let's say on a screen, how essentially those bunch of components are going to work together and how they're going to respond. Because sometimes you don't want the same sort of like repetitive information all over your screen, right? So you want to make sure like essentially how it's going to work individually versus how it's going to work grouped as well. So how, when you do turn on voiceover, you don't want someone to like keep, like the screen reader to keep reading back again, but back once is good enough. And yeah, like just like any other feature, like keep making incremental changes. We don't have to essentially go for AAA compliant and make our app accessible from the get-go. You can start adding, it's just like any other feature. As you start adding slowly and steadily, your app becomes accessible. And obviously, get designers onboarded on this as well, just because adding those incremental changes will really help reduce the overhead of your work a lot. So now that I kind of like spoke about it like from a design perspective, let's just take a look at some of the properties that React Native provides for accessibility. So essentially, like the accessibility label, this is it's a very standard property on a lot of text elements and view wrappers as well. So what it does is whenever you add an accessibility label, it's going to override the text that's read by the screen reader. Accessibility true, it will read everything inside it at once. But if you do have a touchable and if you add accessibility equals true, then it's not going to be clickable. So please make sure that you use this property very carefully. Accessibility traits. So for example, like this is specifically like, let's say a specific element is supposed to look like perform like a header, then provide an accessibility trait property of a header or image and so on. But again, if you follow the semantics essentially, and if you use an image element, if you use a header element, or if you use a text element or whatever, then you're going to get that for free. So if you follow the semantics, it's a great start. But if you're obviously we are doing sometimes more than that, so keep an eye on these properties as well. Again, component type. One thing I forgot to mention is accessibility traits is only for Apple. For Android, essentially, it's accessibility component type. So the type of selected element could be radio button, checkbox, and so on. And there's a lot of properties in the docs itself, but this is like sort of to give you an idea like what are the different properties on the components. What I've also done is I've built a demo because I thought that this is a great way just to see if I want to add accessibility to an app. I want to show how an app performs before you add accessibility and how you add accessibility props after. So this is Emma. Emma is a web developer, and Emma's role is essentially she wants to try and convince her company to care more about accessibility. And through that process, what she does is she builds an app. And she wants to make sure that she wants to show all the users on how accessibility could be added. And just an example, just to set an example for her company, that accessibility is not that hard. And as a way to do that, this is an app. And again, what I've done is I've turned on voiceover, and I want to show you how the app behaves before accessibility has been added, and we'll also see how the app will behave after. And you can kind of see like the differences. And again, like just because I still use some of the semantics and stuff, it's still not it's not the worst. Obviously, it can be better. But just to give you an example.
Swipe up with 3 fingers to close. Emma is a web developer who wants.
So as you can see, like this is just an onboarding experience where there's a picture, there's an image, and there's some text. Just because I'm using the text element, it's just going to read whatever is in there.
To convince her company to care more. Emma is a web developer who wants to. Emma is a web.
So what I'm doing is essentially I'm just clicking on different buttons just to make sure like exactly what that button is doing. I can hear a click, but there's nothing on the button, so I'm not sure what exactly that button is for. Now I have navigated to another screen. Again, I'm not really sure what's happening.
She is currently on a mobile project.
And again, I have no idea what that specific button is for, what it's doing. As we saw in the voiceover example, when we did click back, it read it as back, right? Similarly, there's nothing over here.
She is currently on a She is current.
And what I'm doing is, I'm essentially navigated to the login screen, and I haven't even like got the chance to like actually read everything on the page because I had no idea because the voiceover was turned on. And this is just a very basic example. Like I just use some of the semantics and we see the code, and then I add accessibility properties to that code, and let's see how the app performs. So yeah, this is just an example. I have added the accessibility properties, and we will see the code. What the screen reader is going to do is it's going to detect the elements which are marked accessible. Otherwise, it is really hard to know for the screen reader what to do specifically if you don't follow the semantics, right? And essentially, they also reinforce the importance of accessibility as well. So let's take a look.
Emma is walking through the scene. Image. Emma is a web developer who wants to convince her company to care more about accessibility. Next. Done. Emma is with her mobile app. Image. She is currently on a mobile project.
So as you can see, like now this is giving me a lot more context, like what this onboarding experience looks like, right? And this is just a very basic example, but our apps do have, a lot of them do have onboarding experience, right? And this is just an example like how we can start making the app accessible.
That will showcase her ability to make mobile apps accessible.
Cool.
Previous. Done. Done.
Cool. Okay, so let's just take a look at an example on how some of the code looks like. And on the left-hand side is the onboarding screen itself, and on the right-hand side is the code. I have essentially used a library called React Native App Intro Slider. And this is just a render item function handler that essentially is going to render the items in the slider itself. It takes in also a slide object. And every action on the screen essentially is pass and handler. So as you can see, except the styles, like you can see like the render done button, render next button, and so on. This is just the setup. This is like the slides object. So as you can see, what I'm passing in is a couple of accessibility properties, which is the accessibility label text, accessibility label image. So as you can see, when you do click an image, what happens? And then when you do click an image, what exactly is going to happen? And let's take a look at what when you do click on the render item handler itself, what exactly it's going to do. So as you can see, again, just because I added accessibility true to the view itself, it's going to take in the accessibility label. It's going to read as that. And then I added accessibility role as image. Now, again, I didn't need to do that, but just for the sake of providing an example, I'm doing it. Just because I used image, I was able to like add a role. Sometimes it's like iffy, and that's why I'm just like, I added a role whenever possible, if it's just going to be a common component anyway. Again, adding labels, so we describe what the specific image is doing. And keep that in mind, especially like, this is literally like all text that we use on the web, right? Like ARIA labels when we use on the web. And you don't need to be super descriptive about what this image is doing, but just to give the users an idea who are using VoiceOver, how that image is, what that specific image is doing. Again, accessibility label on the text. And these are the handlers passed in. So let's take a look at that. This is the next button. So when you do press next on the screen, how it's going to perform. So again, I added, just because I use just a specific library for icons, just to get those icons on the screen, I didn't need to add accessibility role label, button specifically because they didn't have a role, right? And they're going to act as buttons. And I added an accessibility label next, and that's why when we went next, we were able to kind of see that. Again, this is the login form itself, and I didn't talk a lot about it, but just to give you an idea how this form will look like. I'm using a library for forms called React Native Paper. So I've noticed that whenever you use existing libraries that do have a lot of the accessibility props, a lot of them do a good job, and definitely a shout out to React Native Paper for that, just because a lot of accessibility got baked in, just because I was using a library that did use that. So again, this is the header, which is A11Y, an accessibility login form, again, a text input, and I've added a label, enter your username. Same thing for password. One additional thing over here is also the hint aspect. So just because when you do click on the password field, you also want to provide a hint that the password needs to be 6 characters or so on. Again, no need to add a role for button, just because I just added a label over here. Just because semantically it's a button, so I don't need to do that additionally. So yeah, so this is just a very basic example, right, on how we could add different accessibility props to the code itself and how it performs before and after, just to give us like a more bigger picture on what's happening. I also want to share some of the lessons learned through this process. So when you're using a third-party library, essentially, just make sure that it's flexible enough that you could actually inject accessibility properties to it. Just because I did, when I was building this demo, I used a library for onboarding just so that I can demonstrate accessibility, right, in a very simple way. But the library itself wasn't flexible where I could actually add properties to it. So my app, my onboarding experience was not accessible. And that's a problem, right? And then I had to do additional things to inject properties, so I just switched the library, which gave me more flexibility. And that's why it's really important to make sure that we actually pick a library that's good. And also, like, as open source developers, just make sure that when you are building those libraries, make them flexible for users. Either add it yourself, the properties, or just to make sure, or add docs on it, or just like make it flexible. Be a little bit careful with accessible equals true, essentially, just because whenever you add that to the root level element, it's kind of not going to read what's underneath it. And bringing users' attention to errors. So essentially, if there is an error on the page, so let's say when in a login form, you do try to enter the username and password and hit submit, and it's an incorrect password for some reason or incorrect username, then make sure that you are actually calling out attention to errors as well. So these are some of the accessibility testing tools. And so accessibility scanner for Android and then accessibility inspector for Apple. These are some of the tools that could actually help improve accessibility, and you can test it out. So for example, in my case, what I did was I just hooked it up with accessibility inspector for Apple. And as you can see over here, on the left-hand side is the text. So Emma is a web developer. On the right-hand side, I know there's a lot going on, but one thing I would like to call out is this action and the value and the type, right? So it's actually telling me what is the type, how the specific screen reader is going to read it as, and when I do perform an action, what's going to happen with that. And also at the bottom, it gives me like a tiny tree just to give me an idea how the screen reader is reading the different elements. And this is just a basic onboarding experience example, right? But as you add like more stuff, as you do have more elements to it, it makes it it's more readable, and it's really helpful. And lastly, improve your development process. There is a linter from Formidable Labs. It's an ESLint plugin for React Native specifically. And what it does, it will tell you certain elements do need accessibility properties. You can also add your custom rules to it. So like when you do add common components and so on, just create a new rule that this is, when these are the elements, this is the specific rule, and this is the specific property you want them to prompt you for. And it really helps a lot. I've used it on a few projects already, and it's great. It also, like certain touchable elements should have accessibility role property, or both, or accessibility traits and accessibility component type for Android or iOS. There's a lot going on, right? And obviously, we need to read the docs just to make sure we are good with that, and there's good testing with it. But this linter is great for just getting you started. And we all love linters, right? It's because we love ESLint, TSLint plugins, and so on. And lastly, just design for everyone, regardless of culture, language, life stage, ability, or device. Accessibility is a priority and not an afterthought. The reality is that in future, or maybe even now, it could be you. So it's just that keep all users in mind when we are thinking about accessibility, right? Not just, we are not segregating, we should not segregate any other specific users, but keep when we're designing it, keep everyone in mind when we are building it, just like the curb cut effect that we took a look at, right? It wasn't designed for a specific user, it worked for everyone. And there are design experience, and we are much further ahead in our design principles and whatnot, just to get accessibility working as well, right? So having said that, thank you so much. That's my Twitter. And these are my slides as well, which I've deployed. So yeah, thank you for listening.